Hey everyone, how are you doing? Hope you're doing well. It's a beautiful morning out here. I figured I'd get outside and shoot this video, so I apologize for the different sound than usual. You probably hear some crickets and some people working back there. There's some kind of workshop back there in the back. I've been talking a lot recently about Rand on this show. I did an interview with my friend Timothy Sandifer about his book, Freedom's Furies. That book is a sort of intellectual biography of Ayn Rand, Isabel Patterson, and Rose Wilder Lane. And then last episode, I talked about Rand's objectivist ethics, her approach to morality. And I appreciate all the kind words, by the way, all the comments and suggestions for future episodes. Thank you, Yash, Pablo, Simon, everyone else who left a comment. Thank you. I've been talking a lot recently about Rand, and I'm a fan of this economist that you guys probably know, Bryan Caplan. I think he works out of George Mason University. He's a really smart guy. I've seen him at different conferences speaking about free markets and the need to have open immigration. In fact, he did an interview for the journal that I edit, The Objective Standard, where he talked about the connection between open borders and innovation. It's really, really fascinating stuff. He recently sent out an article to his Substack subscribers criticizing some of Rand's ideas and really doing it in a way that those who aren't really familiar with the ideas would find plausible, but would also think undermine most or all of Rand's ideas and appeal. So I figured, since I've been talking a lot about the value of Rand's ideas, that this would be a good opportunity to start a little conversation, so to speak, with Caplan. If you happen to see this, Bryan, I'd love to have a conversation with you on the channel. So what did Caplan say, and what do I want to say about what Caplan said? So he's notable for showing the plausibility of, and sometimes even truth of, really counterintuitive ideas, but occasionally his arguments recoil on themselves, and so it is with this recent article. It's called Sanction, the Triumph of Ayn Rand's Worst Idea, which he recently sent out to his Substack subscribers. Now, he actually wrote and published the article like 5 years ago, I think in 2018. He had a debate coming up with a follower and an advocate of Rand's ideas, so he resent it. He sent it back out, and that's how it came to my attention. And anyway, there in that article, he argues that Ayn Rand is responsible for much of the nastiness of today's public discourse. Sort of. He acknowledges at the same time in this article that the problem as it exists today couldn't really have come from Rand. He says, is Rand really causally responsible for modernity's moral intolerance? Probably not. The lines of intellectual communication don't fit. So he's saying there that Rand's idea couldn't really have leaked out into the culture via Rand directly, because it just doesn't make sense. The people who are taking up this idea aren't even really familiar with Rand or her ideas. So they don't fit, he says. The intellectual lines of communication don't fit. Despite the fact that Rand's novels have topped readers' polls for the best and most influential literature of the 20th century, despite the fact that Rand's ideas helped birth the liberty movement that Caplan is really a part of, he says that so many people love to hate Rand that, quote, she has not been broadly influential. Counterintuitively, then, one of Rand's most peculiar ideas, he says, has spread like wildfire. So she's not been broadly influential, yet this peculiar idea of hers has spread like wildfire. Both saying that she hasn't influenced the culture and that she has, but actually she couldn't have done it directly or really at all, as I think. See. So his concern in the article is not to explain how this happened, but just to bemoan the quote-unquote fact that it has happened. And the idea is that justice requires morally evaluating those that one deals with and never sitting idly by while one's values are being attacked. So he quotes from Rand's response to a reader's question. So a reader wrote to Rand back in the 60s, and she wrote this response in 1962 called How Does One Lead a Rational Life in an Irrational Society? And that was published in a volume called The Virtue of Selfishness. She wrote to this person, one must never fail to pronounce moral judgment. Nothing can corrupt and disintegrate a culture or a man's character as thoroughly as does the precept of moral agnosticism, the idea that one must never pass moral judgment on others, that one must be morally tolerant of anything, that the good consists of never distinguishing the good from evil. It is obvious who profits and who loses by such a precept. It is not justice or equal treatment that you grant to men when you abstain equally from praising men's virtues and from condemning men's vices. And your impartial attitude declares, in effect, that neither the good nor the evil may expect anything from you. Whom do you betray and whom do you encourage? Now, try as you might, you're not going to find any examples in Caplan's piece of what Rand's idea calls for in practice. Instead, he assures us, based on his first-hand experience with a subculture, he writes, the subculture that embraced Rand's virtue of moral intolerance, that this idea means never talking to those you disagree with, or even those who talk to those you disagree with. So it means, in effect, hermetically sealing yourself off from anyone and everyone with opposing views. So as he puts it, what does this mean in practice? Don't talk to your intellectual enemies, and don't talk to people who talk to your intellectual enemies, because they're your enemies too. Sure, you can denounce them, can't have a civilized conversation. Indeed, engaging in such a conversation practically makes you as bad as they are. Obviously, anyone in his right mind has to agree with Caplan that that sounds like a terrible idea. And perhaps it's an idea that Caplan and some other people that called themselves objectivists practiced. If they did, then no doubt with disastrous results. And it might even be an idea that moderately famous and self-described objectivists have practiced. I don't know. I wasn't there, and Caplan for a time apparently was. And in my experience, he seems like a great guy. I have no reason to doubt his testimony. But what I do know is that the idea he outlines is not the one that Rand espoused in print. Not in that essay, and not anywhere else to my knowledge. What she did write, if you look at that essay and you look elsewhere, what she did write is not that we shouldn't talk to those with views we oppose, but that we shouldn't sit idly by when such people attack our values. Because doing so implies at best that we can mount no rational disagreement, and at worst, and this is really Rand's point, that it implies we agree with them. So let's get some concrete examples on the table, the kind you won't find in Caplan's article. So suppose, for instance, that you're at lunch with a potential business partner, and he makes a racist or a sexist comment to the waitress. What do you do? Well, according to Rand, you morally ought to condemn his bigotry, and no doubt many people would agree. But it's worth asking why Rand upheld this idea as a matter of principle that one should act on in all such cases. And what many who love to hate Rand overlook, and this is a point that Caplan makes, lots of people love to hate Rand. What many people love to hate Rand overlook, or willfully ignore, perhaps, is that the central purpose of Rand's philosophy, and the end toward which all of her key ideas are offered as means, is a life of happiness. The purpose of philosophy, she held, is, quote, to teach you not to suffer and die, but to enjoy yourself and live. So the reason it's wrong to suffer immoral fools silently is not because it feels right, and it's not because Rand said so. The reason is that judging people rationally and treating them accordingly, that is, practicing the virtue of justice, is a vital part of the pursuit of happiness, whereas failing to do so signals approval of or indifference to immoral behavior, which invites and encourages more irrationality and injustice, all to the detriment of one's own life, to the destruction of one's own values, and ultimately, if everybody does this, if this practice is widely adopted, it leads to the demise of civil society. So that's why it's wrong, for instance, for the high school football player to sit on his hands while a bully beats up a young kid and takes his lunch money. And it's why it's wrong not to investigate and, if need be, reprimand or fire an employee that you catch lying to you, stealing, or being rude, insulting your customers. And it's why it's wrong to appease terrorists, turning the other cheek, and this is really one of Rand's key points, is that turning the other cheek is not a virtue. It's a vice. It's the vice of laying a red carpet over your life and values and inviting others to walk all over them. So Rand's admonition against morally sanctioning evil might seem peculiar when taken out of context, but when we hold that context and when we consider how to properly act in concrete situations in our lives, the idea of never sanctioning evil appears to be a virtually obvious requirement of justice and thereby of ultimately leading a flourishing life. Caplan even concedes this. Really, he accedes to the core idea of Rand's argument. He says that we should not listen respectfully to everyone. Personally, I draw the line at avowed communists and Nazis. They really are unworthy of a response. Therefore, I don't respond to them. And I say to that, amen. That's exactly the kind of line drawing that Rand considered rationally and morally necessary. But communists, Nazis, and other racists aside, applying this idea, the principle of justice, is often, and almost always, really difficult. Rand wrote, to pronounce moral judgment is an enormous responsibility. Just as a judge in a court of law may err when the evidence is inconclusive, but may not evade the evidence available, nor accept bribes, nor allow any personal feeling, emotion, desire, or fear to obstruct his mind's judgment of the facts of reality, so every rational person must maintain an equally strict and solemn integrity in the courtroom within his own mind. And then a little further on in the same essay that Caplan is quoting, she writes, to judge means to evaluate a given concrete by reference to an abstract principle or standard. It is not an easy task. It is not a task that can be performed automatically by one's feelings, instincts, or hunches. It is a task that requires the most precise, the most exacting, the most ruthlessly objective and rational process of thought. And Rand also didn't condone the sort of shoot first, listen never mudslinging that you see online today and that Caplan's article really laments. The policy of always pronouncing moral judgment does not mean that one must regard oneself as a missionary charged with the responsibility of saving everyone's soul, nor that one must give unsolicited moral appraisals to all those one meets. It means, A, that one must know clearly in full, verbally identified form one's own moral evaluation of every person, issue, and event with which one deals, and act accordingly. B, that one must make one's moral evaluation known to others when it is rationally appropriate to do so. This last means that one need not launch into unprovoked moral denunciations or debates, but that one must speak up in situations where silence can objectively be taken to mean agreement with or sanction of evil. When one deals with irrational persons, where argument is futile, a mere "I don't agree with you" is sufficient to negate any implication of moral sanction. When one deals with better people, a full statement of one's views may be morally required. Now, undoubtedly, many objectivists have failed. Many people in general have failed to properly apply these ideas. But neither they nor anyone else are safe in that error. As Rand said, reality is the court of final appeal. So to the extent a person is wrong, he suffers consequences, be it by wasting his life building, as Caplan puts it, a tower of error, alienating would-be allies and thereby stultifying progress toward his own goals, or other consequences otherwise. Nonetheless, though, their failures to understand and properly apply this idea are irrelevant to the truth or falsity of the idea itself. Nor does fidelity to this idea, that is, that we should scrupulously follow the truth wherever it leads and evaluate those we deal with based not on feelings or wishes but on facts, explain today's uncivil discourse. Actually, that problem long predates Rand. In fact, it was one of her key targets in that essay in the same piece that Caplan quotes. She wrote, "It is only in today's reign of amoral cynicism, subjectivism, and hooliganism," love that word, "that men may imagine themselves free to utter any sort of irrational judgment and suffer no consequences." End quote. And what's more, not only was this idea prevalent in the 60s, or this persistent sort of fault of uncivil discourse prevalent in the 60s when she wrote this, in the early 60s. But Americans really have been dealing with this problem for centuries, and probably people have been dealing with it forever. But anyone familiar with the early history of America can attest that such hooliganism goes back at least as far as the first and second presidential runoffs between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. The power of social media today it amplifies contentious messages and ideas, so that might have something to do with an apparent increase in social discord. But Rand's ideas on justice and moral sanction are not a cause nor a contributor to this problem. In fact, they are part of the solution. Actually practicing what Rand advocated, and not what has been falsely ascribed to her, requires not only having, and when appropriate, providing valid reasons for one's views and values, but also raising one's standards of evaluation and throwing out all considerations of team affiliation or group identity, assessing people and positions on their merits, and refraining, as Rand said, from unprovoked moral denunciations or debates, following the truth wherever it leads. That, of course, requires listening to and grappling with opposing views, not lobbing criticisms and retreating into one's intellectual ghetto, as Caplan puts it, even when those views come from people one loves to hate. So, to borrow Julia Galef's terms, it means being scouts, not soldiers, prioritizing seeing things clearly over defending one's current position. It means, as Adam Grant points out, being willing to think again when the evidence contradicts your views. Now, these are new formulations, excellent formulations, of old ideas, and they name basic requirements of a value that really undergirds Rand's views on justice and moral sanction, and that value is objectivity. And that's a value we need more of, not less. We need more objectivity, not less. And so I think Caplan ultimately gets Rand wrong on this. Perhaps we'll have a conversation at some point about it. So let me know what you guys think in the comments. If you're not subscribed, give me a thumbs up if you like the video, and subscribe. It really does help the channel grow. And let me know what you'd like to see more of. I know that we're going to have a future episode soon in response to one comment who asked for an episode on the nature of individual rights and how that philosophically is justified. So looking forward to that, and until next time, happy flourishing.